Welcome to Shoulda Books, the podcast about all the books you should have read by now. My name is Jonathan, and today I am talking to Emilie Friedlander. Emilie is a writer, editor, and digital strategist whose work has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Pitchfork, Vice, and many more places. She's also the co-host of one of my favorite podcasts, The Culture Journalist, where she and her co-host, Andrea Dominic, dive into the trends, topics, and forces that shape our culture, our politics, and our lives in general. A recent episode about prediction markets, we're talking about like Cauty and Polymarket, was enlightening and terrifying. And if you are someone who enjoys being enlightened and terrified, I highly recommend The Culture Journalist. Now, my conversation with Emilie was not terrifying, but it was enlightening. We had a wide-ranging conversation about various topics, everything from fame as performance art, as personified in people like Bob Dylan, to the eternal scourge of daylight savings time. We covered a lot of ground. I enjoyed the hell out of this conversation, and I hope you do too. But first, housekeeping. Thank you again to everyone who has signed up for the Shoulda Books Patreon. If you want the ad-free extended version of this episode, head on over to patreon.com/Shoulda Books. You'll find, like I said, the ad-free extended version of this episode, but you'll also find a whole lot more. Now, for the Shoulda Book Club, we are wrapping up Bronte Month this Saturday, February 28th. The Jane Eyre episode airs. Sorry, I won't do that again. It comes out. It drops. The Jane Eyre episode drops this Saturday, and I found that I really enjoyed this book. I kind of slogged through the first 150 pages or so and was like, man, this is a chore. But guess what? It gets better. It got much better, and I ended up really enjoying this book. And that episode comes out this Saturday. The next book, the book for March, is The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. I do not have a copy yet, but I will. Mark my words, I will. I really need to get on that, actually. But if you don't have a copy and you'd like to get a copy, then I would encourage you to hit up the links in the description of this episode, because those are affiliate links to bookshop.org. Bookshop.org is an organization that lets you buy books from independent bookstores around the country. So if you buy from bookshop.org, you are helping local bookstores. And if you buy from the links in the description, you are helping me because I get a little tiny commission from those affiliate links. Okay, I think that is everything. Let's get to my conversation with Emilie Friedlander, and let's hit the books. Welcome to Shoulda Books. How you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
So for your podcast that you co-host, The Culture Journalist, which we were just talking off mic. I'm a huge fan. I think you and your co-host, Andrea Dominic, do just phenomenal work. I encourage everyone listening to check it out.
Thank you.
For that podcast, you read a lot of books. I'm curious, what sort of books are you reading for the podcast, and what sort of books are you reading just for fun?
Oh my God. I am reading a lot of new books for the podcast, unlike this podcast where it's sort of, pulling from many different eras. So it's a lot of up and coming, usually nonfiction books that are usually dealing with contemporary culture and contemporary media, sometimes technology, from the sort of like wider community of authors that like thinkers who are thinking big picture about like the media landscape in 2026, basically.
Are you able to still find time to read stuff just for you? Or is it mostly podcasts? Where I'm kind of, there's an agenda to this question because I'm trying to figure out the balance for myself as, like reading for this podcast versus like reading books just for fun. So I'm curious if you've been able to strike that balance.
Totally. It's actually been quite hard because I wear a lot of hats. I work on a lot of different projects, not even just this podcast. And so I have books that I have to read for the podcast. Then because our podcast is quite theoretical, I'm often revisiting like older theoretical essays to try to like make sure that I'm brushed up on my terminology. And then I'm in a book club that is like with a bunch of musicians and academics that is mostly reading fiction. And I'm trying really hard to read the books and show up, but I keep on having like conflicts. But I'm trying to read like one fiction book a month, but it's looking more like one every 2 months or every 3 months, right? Like in the last half a year.
Before we get into the books that you brought, I got you a book which somehow made it in time. It's become a bit of a running joke that when I do these remote recordings, the book doesn't get there in time. So I'm thrilled that it actually did. But you have that package in front of you, but we're not going to open it till the end of the episode. So, and we'll find out at the end whether this is something, A, that you have read before. There's a very high chance that you have. And B, if you haven't, if it's something that you think you'll like. So stick around, folks. We'll find that out. But without further ado, Emilie, what is the first book that you think everyone should read?
Okay. I guess I'll try to go in order. I will, of like when I read them, I will start with this book, which is a collection, less of a like read from cover to cover kind of thing, and more of a having just have it in your living room and open it from time to time, I would say, and read something amazing. But it's this book, The Essential Ellen Willis.
And this is a collection of essays, right, from a very influential critic. Can you tell us a little bit about Ellen Willis?
Yeah, definitely. She is sadly no longer with us. Something that people don't know, like often know when we talk about music journalism. I got my start as a music journalist for many, many years. And it's it has historically been a very male-dominated field. At least it was a very male-dominated field when I entered it. But the first ever pop music critic for the New Yorker magazine was a woman critic named Ellen Willis. I believe she was from New York City. And she's really, really brilliant. Actually, she ended up later founding a program at NYU, which is where I went to grad school in my 20s, which is it's part of the NYU journalism school, but it's called the Cultural Reporting and Criticism program. And she founded the school. And so I was sort of like, I don't know if I was like trained in her ways or anything, but I think her approach was really, really cool. And maybe like a specific niche within culture journalism that doesn't get a lot of focus. Like she actually at one point dated this other really famous music critic whose name was Robert Christgau, who is like one of the most famous music critics historically. He's associated with the Village Voice, and his whole thing that he was famous for was this like influential consumer guide column where he was like rating records as this sort of like consumer object. So they were kind of like short and pithy reviews. He also was involved in the Paz and Jop poll and the creation of that. But what's interesting is that I think that the Robert Christgau model of like reviews sort of ended up predominating in music journalism, but Ellen Willis took this much more like sociological approach where she wasn't like, oh, is this a proper consumer item or not a proper, like, should you buy this or should you not buy this? She was like, I'm going to use music. Well, she wrote about all sorts of things, but in the case of music, she was like, this is a text that I'm looking at to try to understand the world and society and politics. And that's sort of like, I think that idea was very like fundamental to my work and eventually The Culture Journalist. Whereas I think, the other people, we often talk about like the other kind of music journalism when we think of music journalism, but
Yeah, there definitely seems to be the predominant strain is, like you said, like basically a consumer binary, basically, of just like yes or no. Is this something that you should spend your money on? Like I think about in the realm of like film criticism, I think of Rotten Tomatoes and how it's like all of criticism these days seems to be just weighted on that score. And it's like, if that score is above a certain threshold, then it's like, okay, this is a film that I shall watch. And if it's below, then it is no. And it's like, it just leaves so little nuance and is just kind of feels intellectually impoverished in a way that it feels very sad. So I know that, so you sent me one of the essays from this book that was about Bob Dylan. And I read it and I loved it. I thought the way that she just spoke about music was one, so knowledgeable. Like she clearly just like, you know, knew where every current was coming from and the kind of the like the path and the history of everything, but she blended it in such a way that was like poetic and lyrical in its own way. So why the Dylan essay from this collection? Why was that the one that you chose?
I think that it was one of the first things of hers that I read, and I think it's very emblematic of her approach to writing. I also started thinking about it a lot when I saw the Bob Dylan biopic. Did you see it?
I did.
With Timmy?
I did, and I have a lot of thoughts on it.
Yeah, and it came back to mind, and that was when I had read it, obviously, in grad school, and then had returned to it a few times over the years, but then when I saw that, came back to it again. And something that I thought was interesting about that movie, is it okay if I talk about the movie?
For sure, yeah.
Yeah, was that it sort of like glossed over a little bit the relationship between Bob Dylan and the folk artists who sort of like took him under their wing at the beginning of his career. And they sort of, like Pete Seeger, and it sort of made it seem like the main drama of the movie was this conflict between him remaining faithful to this tradition of folk music that was, you know, very associated with their leftist politics, and then his own desire to innovate or something. And so that's kind of, and then he finally does the Newport Folk Fest, and I guess it like causes the climax of the drama, and people get really mad at him, but he's still like he's going his own way. And I was like, this is such an American narrative, kind of a classically American narrative of like it's an individualistic narrative about, you know, oh, I'm triumphing by, like, so many narratives in media. And I know this is someone who has like worked in and edited many, many music magazines. Like the narrative is always like, you are a star who, you know, you achieve sort of like product market fit of your art and the world by becoming, you know, as perfectly and unapologetically yourself as possible. Or you give into your individualism, and you become wholly yourself, and then that causes you the narratives. Like if you look at cover stories, it's almost always that kind of thing. And that, I feel like that was the message of the movie. But then I was like, wait a second, there must be more to this. And I went back and was like looking a little bit at like sort of like the rift between him and Pete Seeger and stuff, and how like it wasn't just about like, oh, I'm innovating musically, like I'm taking this folk and I'm introducing rock. It was him. It was like there was a political reason for it, where at the time the folk musicians this was like very tied to their revolutionary politics. Like the folk, there was a deep tradition of people who were playing these songs in this particular way that was tied to devotion to a political cause, right? And so I felt that the movie sort of underplayed that. It made it seem like it was just Bob Dylan being like, oh, these fusty old guys doing this old kind of music, and I'm going to be, I'm going to be the creative genius and change things, when it was actually that, seen by his contemporaries as him sort of abandoning the movement for his own kind of commercial gain. And so this essay by Ellen Willis, which was written 1967, she's already kind of talking about this and sort of like his understanding his career in terms of this like kind of obsessive individualism that he has, and also the kind of understanding like his art as being that he is creating this persona and performing almost as an actor and sort of like making moves within fame and within the pop ecosystem, understanding that as a performance on the level of like Andy Warhol or something. Rather than just like, oh, he's a genius and he made great music and he wanted,
I thought that was a great comparison in the essay between him and Warhol, and how, they're two sides kind of the same coin of like, the surface kind of being the point of like the performance, and that any sort of like the lack of depth is the depth in a way. There was one quote in particular from this essay that I thought the whole essay was like, wow, this could have been written yesterday, but it's still so relevant and reads so kind of contemporary. But she says, the tenacity of the modern publicity apparatus often makes artists' personalities more familiar than their work, while its pervasiveness obscures the work of those who cannot or will not be personalities. And it's like, holy shit, she wrote that in 1967. Like, that's only gotten more, it's only gotten more relevant, And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that idea of like the apparatus kind of rewarding those who are willing to kind of make a performance out of their life, especially their personal life, while punishing those who don't want to make that bargain.
I mean, it's more relevant than ever, right? Like in the age of social media, and, we have to, like so many artists that I talk to, musicians complain that they're having to spend more time working on TikTok and Instagram strategy than they can, than they are focusing on their music. And it's like, and it's not just for musicians, it's for everybody. It's for journalists. Like I have to deal with that. My podcast has to deal with that. I do find it interesting that Bob Dylan sort of like seemed to be having fun with it. And I wish that more people would have fun with it by subverting the rules, which he did a lot. And it's kind of like ridiculous. And like she clearly sees through his shtick of like constantly reinventing himself every few years, and that it's a game that he is playing and having fun playing. I thought of this essay again recently because I've been following the rise of Geese and Cameron Winter, and
I was just thinking about that. Yeah,
how people kind of compare him to Dylan, and like also some of it is just obviously the music is great, but there's also some like persona building in a similar way where he's like telling falsehoods about his life and stuff, and like it's funny that like the music like you can just like do that, and then the music press like is like, oh wow, this is so different and innovative when it's like been going on for decades. Or like Bob Dylan, I'm sure people have done it like before Bob Dylan or whatever, but like Bob Dylan was doing it and people are like, don't you see that this is like a thing that Bob Dylan did? But yeah, at least they're having fun with it, right?
Yeah. That I really, based on that one essay, I'm like, I need to read more of her work. What are some other standout essays from that book?
She wrote a lot about music, obviously, but she also wrote a lot about other topics, a lot about politics, a lot about feminism. A big issue for her was she was like kind of cut against the grain at one point by being a feminist who argued against a ban on pornography. She had very, very like strong. I don't know. She just like had very strong convictions and was not afraid to like have an unpopular opinion. One piece that I liked was her piece about the Velvet Underground. If you're a fan of the Velvet Underground,
I am. Yeah, I need to check that out.
Another that I actually just I was just reading before we came on was this essay called "Women and the Myth of Consumerism," and it was talking about how she was often like critiquing leftist movements like from the inside, and she was saying how often people derided like female targeted consumer culture as being and female consumption of like things like beauty products or something as being like one of the things keeping women down. And she was saying like, no, I think that that's just like one of the few pleasures that's allowed to women. It sounded very like third wave, or it sounds like something that someone would say like would have said like more recently than she was writing. But she was saying like, no, it is patriarchy that is or it is a male expectation or men having power and circumscribing women to like a smaller role or a smaller sphere of influence, and that is just like a way that they can exercise their influence within the power structure. So don't attack women buying makeup. Try to like male leftists should not do that. They should instead, they should instead look at the power relations between men and women first. And it was especially saying this was bad because there shouldn't be a hierarchy within leftism or feminism between women who buy into that sort of consumer culture and women who don't, because that is not useful. So yeah, just like, I don't know, everything she writes is just so startling and fresh, either because it was prescient or because it's like an opinion that you hadn't thought of. And I just really like the idea that one of the best music critics ever was a woman that nobody knows about. But now, hopefully, more people will know about her.
Yeah. Check out Ellen Willis. But the next book that you have, you want to intro that one?
This is kind of like a esoteric pick. I don't actually physically have the book with me. I think I've only read it as like a PDF online, though I have a friend who has a really nice copy of it. It's called KLF's The Manual, which is a 1988 manual on how to have a number one song on the British or the UK pop charts, basically. Step-by-step manual.
So you sent this to me. I was not familiar with it at all, but yeah, I was really charmed by it. I had not heard the song, so basically, this group, this duo KLF, recorded kind of like a novelty pop hit called let me see if I can get this right. It's Doctor in the TARDIS, I believe.
Doctor in the TARDIS.
And it's I'll say it. It's an annoying song.
Yeah, it's not a. I mean, it's a novelty hit. It was not. It's not my favorite. If my favorite of their work is their third album, which is called Chill Out, which is like a ambient record, or it was like known as a pioneering record of ambient house. It's beautiful. It's pretty. I like pretty music a lot of the time. This is like, it's almost like maybe it was the equivalent of like edgelordy or something for its time. And
yeah,
maybe a kind of a joke.
Right. Yeah. There definitely feels like there's some tongue in cheek there. But can you kind of tell the story of how this book came about and the story kind of behind like their creation of this wonderful song?
Yeah. So like the KLF were pranksters. So it was these two guys, Bill Drummond and Jimmy Cauty. They started in Liverpool and London in the late 80s. And they had music, some that I like more than, like some songs that I like more than others, or some works that I like more than others. But it was also sort of I would say it was like an art project, sort of often commenting on the mechanics of the music industry, which is, obviously what I look at, a lot of what we look at in the culture journalist. And so they would deface billboards. They were really inspired by the Situationists, and they would create these like quote unquote anarchic situations. And so they would like post cryptic advertisements in the NME. They would like, at one point, I think they announced they were quitting music, and they like fired blanks into the audience at the Brit Awards, which is crazy, and dumped a dead sheep at an after party announcing their retirement. They deleted their entire back catalog. They famously at one point burnt £1 million. Like they had only £1 million of song revenues left, and they burnt it, and then they filmed it, and then they were like really upset. I think they got like upset after they burned it. They were like, why did we do that? But yeah. So it was as much a musical project as it was sort of like an elaborate, extended like performance art type project. But they had a lot of #1 singles, and at one point they were, I think they were like had some of the highest sales in the UK. And so one of the singles they did was Doctor and the TARDIS they also changed names a lot. So they were going under the Time Lords at this point. And they got a single to #1. It's not that great. Maybe people liked it at the time. I don't know. And then they wrote a book called The Manual about how to have this #1 hit, basically. And it's almost like spilling their secrets, and it's just sort of a commentary on what it takes to be a famous musician, and how it's almost like a formula you can follow, but there's like lots of trade-offs and stuff.
What were some of the steps that they offered in their formula?
Well, a lot of it involves like spending money on a lot of things. Like you kind of get the sense of like, they're like, we're going to give you, they talk about like the golden rules of pop, and that, it's not about originality. There's some level of self-expression, but it's not about creating something people have never heard before. It's about following these like specific rules of like how the song should be structured. And then they kind of just walk you through like, on Monday, book studio time and book this many days of studio time, and then do this when you're there, and then hire a plugger, which is somebody who puts the song on radio stations and TV, hire a publicist, open a bank account and do this, hire a lawyer, and like you're like spending all this money basically, and then finally it kind of like reveals towards the end. I couldn't really get a read on this exactly, but like at the point at which you have this single that follows the golden rules and everything is ready to go, it gets like finally put in stores. You have these guys that you pay to sort of like go to the stores and like maybe buy copies and give them away for free, or do something to like basically artificially manipulate the chart numbers. And it makes it seem very pay to play sort of. And basically the idea is that you're following all these steps, and here's all the money you have to expend, and you're going to get a hit. But the implication is that you probably won't have very much money left over after this all happens, because you've spent so much money making it happen.
If there was going to be a 2026 update to the manual, what do you think would go in it?
Oh my God. I actually worked with this writer, Ezra Marcus, who I used to work with at Vice. We worked on it was in like maybe 2017. We worked on our own, like a modern version of the manual. I'm not sure if we ever actually published it, but I think a lot of it would have to be more about like maybe pulling some sort of stunt to inflate views on TikTok or YouTube, or I don't know, like I don't know if they like I'll actually allow this anymore. But like, I remember at one point people were hiring like bots, like bot farms to like ding media over and over and over again to like get the plays up. But basically the interesting thing, I think like not much has changed since the book, other than the fact that the record industry has sort of, shifted away from physical sales to streaming. So it would be like similar antics on the internet, probably.
I'm curious because, so this book was written 1988, is that right? So like that's, we're about to enter the 90s, and like the famous refrain from the 90s is like, don't sell out. There was such such a antagonism towards like selling out. And I think that has completely shifted now. And it's like, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on like when that shift happened and why that shift happened.
I think it's kind of understood as inevitable. I think there might be a little bit of a revolt against that happening in some quarters, but I want to plug a book by a writer who we had on the podcast, W. David Marks. It's called Blank Space, and it just came out late last year. But he actually talks a lot about like, he kind of details and plots out how we went from anti-sellout mentality to sellout to the situation we have now. The beginning of my career was, I got my start as a blogger right around the time, like I was working as a blogger at this blog sister site to Pitchfork called Altered Zones. And I had had independent blogs before that. But I kind of think I lived through the moment where the internet sort of changed how artists relate to the idea of selling out. There was a lot more brands stepping into this space. I think it was economic survival, probably a lot of it. I think it was the collapse of the traditional record industry and the need to make money through other avenues like collaborating with brands. And I think it was just living in a culture where people learned that any attention was better than no attention. And you see this, like we have Donald Trump as our president right now. He is, in David Marks's book, he actually talks about how Donald Trump specifically and Paris Hilton who knew each other, were instrumental in this, but like kind of this rise of an idea of infamy as being just as productive as being beloved. And so there was just like less of a purism. I think that now there might be a little bit of a backlash to that, or especially in like the younger generation, I sense a little bit of a return of a Gen X mentality of being kind of anti-authority and anti-consumerism, or maybe engaging with it in a way that is more tongue-in-cheek. Yeah,
there definitely feels, for lack of a better term, a vibe shift right now, where it just feels like we're kind of reaching, exhaustion with social media. Yeah, I'm curious to see like how that's going to play out across different media, whether it's music or books. So what is the final book that you brought?
So the final book is actually a fiction book. As I said earlier, I don't have time to read a lot of fiction, even though I like fiction. And it is this book called There Is No Anti-memetics Division. I think that it was like recently reissued, or it's like had an interesting story. I think there's a lot of stuff lately, like Heated Rivalry, for example, which came out of like fan fiction communities. Like I think in general, we're starting to see also a lot of like romantic-y stuff. We're starting to see like more and more culture hitting the big time that came out of like fan communities. And so this book also sort of arose out of a fan community, albeit a more sort of science fiction, horror oriented corner of that world. So there's a wiki, which is like a, on Wikipedia. It's like a collaborative fiction writing project. And it is all around something called the SCP Foundation. And it's called the SCP Wiki. And it's basically a bunch of people submitting kind of like scientific reports for paranormal, supernatural, or like other mysterious phenomena that they it's like kind of like fictional reports, but written in the style that like a scientific institution would write about them. And so that is like this very interesting, democratic collaborative project. And then this writer, Quantum, started, I think this book kind of grew out of that. And then it was originally published on a fan fiction site. And then it, like, a lot of people read it there. And then it was like, I don't know exactly, but I think at one point it was hard to come by. And it finally got like a big printing by Ballantine Books. And I think it's very popular. Like it's like both niche and popular.
The cover is beautiful. I really like the cover design. So is the physical book itself there, is that like kind of all stuff that just Quantum has written, or is it like a collection of all the things that like is, or did Quantum serve as more of an editor?
I think this is all written by him, and it's sort of taking this concept and reimagining it as like a novel, like a kind of, I guess it's sort of science fiction novel, but it's also quite disjointed, and I can't really explain it. It hangs together and it's kind of a page turner, and it's like crazy. Like it's the kind of book that every few pages you're like, oh my God, what the hell? But basically it's about like, instead of the SCP Foundation as a whole, it's focusing on this fictional anti-memetics division, which is, does that make sense?
Well, what is anti-memetics? What does that term mean?
Basically, anti-memetics it's the study of anti-memes, which in the universe of the book are these sort of entities that exist beyond science or beyond our normal understanding that are often pertaining to memory, where it's like, it's like hard to explain, but basically they're like supernatural entities that, for example, you cannot remember. And you could like see it and be in a room, like in this scientific organization, the scientists will go into a room to study something, and then when they leave, they can't remember it or something. Or it's something that is kind of the opposite, where if you find out about it, it's dangerous and it like kills you. And so this book follows a central, strong female lead named Quinn, who is like the leader of the Antimemetics division, and she's kind of interfacing with all of these different creatures and trying to keep everything under control, because the idea is like, if you don't study these forces, they could, destroy the world or kill a lot of people. And then you sort of follow her on her journey to save the world in a secret, clandestine way.
I think one of the coolest things about science fiction is all the things that it's able to say about our current world. So I'm curious what this book has to say about life right now.
I read this book alongside another book that is also about anti-memes, but from a nonfiction sort of theoretical perspective, called Anti-memetics, Why Some Ideas Resist Spreading. I think it was like named one of the best books of the year by The New Yorker. And that book actually, like, I recommend people read that book because it kind of develops more of a theory behind what anti-memes are. Quite honestly, the fiction book itself is just a it's very like psychologically disturbing and but in kind of a an alluring way. And I guess you could say that the book alone is it's a lot of it is like a meditation about science and like the limits of like what we can see and what we can discover. And, you know, are we always doing the right thing when we follow science to its farthest possible conclusion? The Anti-memetics book, the Anti-memetics nonfiction book by Nadia Asparouhova is like talking about it from a media perspective, and it's kind of talking about anti-memes as ideas that for one reason or another are dangerous in society, or that conversely we forget. So one, like, obviously we all know what a meme is, and we all understand when we say something is gone viral, a meme has gone viral, etc. But this is talking about ideas that, for example, maybe don't stick, even though they're important. So one example she brings up is daylight savings time, and how nobody wants to keep daylight savings time. Maybe a small percentage of, I don't know, maybe farmers, some of them want to keep daylight. I don't even know if they do.
I have no idea. It's certainly not me. That's for sure. I hate that every twice a year. It's like, why are we doing this? And and like most people like don't want it. There have been multiple, I think Trump said he was going to end daylight savings time, but then didn't. And so it's kind of an anti-meme in that everybody wants it, wants to address it, but it just mysteriously never gets addressed, and we don't really understand why. Another one could be something like climate change, where everybody, has a sense of like, we must urgently act on this, but it never really goes to the top of the agenda somehow. And we're never we have a vague ambient sense of, this is really bad. What is going to happen? And sometimes it does sometimes anti-memes do spill over into memes where they become like a central focus of conversation. Someone like Greta Thunberg, she made it a meme instead of an anti-meme for a moment, but then it sort of just sinks back into this thing where it's in the back of our head and nobody is acting. Yeah, that's fascinating. And it's such a, like, by the nature of it, is going to be about things that you maybe don't think about all the time, like ideas that don't stick.
And then there's other anti-memes where it's more like a bunch of people are simultaneously thinking something at once, but there's a social or political taboo against saying it. And that's like another example of an anti-meme. Maybe even you could say something like Me Too was an anti-meme, and that there was all these people who like knew there was something up with Harvey Weinstein and had their own experiences, but nobody, and it was like it's like an open secret, but it feels dangerous to bring it out into the air. And then it did finally sort of go over into the public view, and then it had like tremendous consequences. Like it converted into, I don't want to, it sounds like I'm making light of it to say a meme, but it flipped over out of the anti-meme into this light, and then it
became an idea that stuck and spread. You bringing up Harvey Weinstein, I started reading a book this year called Down and Dirty Films by Peter Biskind. I chose it because one of his previous books I really, really enjoyed is Easy Riders, Raging Bulls. I don't know if you've ever read it. It's about Easy Riders, Raging Bulls is about the new Hollywood in the late 60s and 70s. And so he kind of wrote like a follow-up to it in 2008 that was about like independent film in the 90s. Are you familiar with this book?
I think I read it. I read the Easy Riders Raging Bulls
Okay.
a long time ago.
The Down and Dirty Films it's telling the story of like independent film in the 90s, and it's looking at it through the Sundance Film Festival and through the Weinstein Company. And so I honestly am not sure if I'm going to finish the book because while it's really well written, the author is he's a phenomenal magazine writer, and his prose just really kind of crackles off the page. But he's spending page after page after page talking about how disgusting and awful Harvey Weinstein is, and how everyone is just putting up with it. And he, of course, I mean, this book was published in 2008, so it stops short of saying anything concrete and making any sort of accusation that would have gotten him, sued. But like knowing what we know now, it's so chilling to just like he talks about how when he first started thinking about the book, he was working at a magazine and he was just kind of talking to his editor about it, not in even a really formal way, just like, I think I want to write this book kind of like about the Weinsteins and about, Sundance and all that stuff. He gets summoned to Harvey Weinstein's office. Like basically someone had heard and someone had snitched. And he talked about how like the Weinsteins just had this like network throughout the entertainment industry of eyes and ears. And so he like goes into Harvey's office, and Harvey's like, he talks about how Harvey Weinstein would like use the carrot and the stick. And so he would be like, oh, what do you really want to write? Oh, you really want to write this book? Don't write this one about me. That won't sell. You write this other one. And like, that was like part of how he was able to get away with what he was doing so much, is that he knew what people wanted and he had the power to give it to them. But it's just, like I said, I don't know if I'm going to finish the book because it's kind of stomach churning, just page after page of like, oh my God, wow. This is awful. But anyway.
And it sounds like he was trying to get the anti-meme out there, but like couldn't quite pull it off.
Exactly. And it obviously didn't stick until another, 9 years later. Like, I wish I would segue on a happier note, but it's come to that part in the episode where I find out if I bought a good book or not. So, do you have the book that I sent you?
I do. How am I going to know if it's a good book if I haven't, maybe I haven't read it yet?
This is a great question, and I was just kind of hoping you'd judge it off the cover.
Okay.
But I don't know. I'm curious if you have read it or not. But go ahead. And I got this one from The Strand.
I saw that.
Yeah, I wanted to find a good one because you're based in Philly. I wanted to find a good Philly bookseller, but I wasn't sure if they were going to like ship in time or not. So I was just like, I'm just going to do The Strand. So are there any Philly bookstores you want to shout out?
Yes. Lot 49 Books. The culture journalist often does events with them. They're really, really excellent up in Fishtown. And Brickbat Books in Queen Village, which is like more of a used bookstore, but they're really awesome too.
Okay.
Oh, and one more, Iffy Books. Okay. But anyway, okay. The End of Myth. I have not read this book.
Okay, yeah, this is The End of the Myth by Greg Grandin. It is nonfiction. It's about the role that the like frontier myth has played in the United States, in the history of the United States, of this idea, again, talking about memes, like this idea that the continent was kind of ordained by God for the European colonialists to just colonize, manifest destiny, all of that. Mm-hmm. And so he looks at kind of the history of that meme and the consequences that it has played out, and how throughout American history, like the kind of the release valve for any sort of social unrest was always just go west, get more real estate, you know? And so I think this book was published during Trump's first term, right before COVID. And I think it's still incredibly relevant, especially given all of the, saber rattling and the lusting over Greenland that that the administration clearly has, of just this idea that like, if America doesn't expand, it will collapse, And so anyway, so it's an examination of that, and it's a book that I found really interesting, and I hope you find it interesting as well.
Amazing. I look forward to reading it.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, not to give you homework, but hopefully you'll be able to slot it in. But where can the people find you?
Just check us out at theculturejournalist.substack.com for now. That's where we are. And I'm under Ad Hoc Emilie, at Ad Hoc Emilie on most platforms. I think Instagram, it might just be Emilie Friedlander, but yeah.
And I have just one last question before I let you go is, what have you checked in on the Tumple people lately?
Oh, no.
I went down the rabbit hole of that because I was looking through your work, and you wrote this very heavily researched and well written essay in, was it 2020, about like a cult that started on Facebook. And I'll put a link to it in the description, but it was a chilling but also very interesting read.
Thank you. Yeah, I think they replied me on some, like they replied me with some other people like over Christmas.
Really? Okay.
But otherwise, no, just check out the story.
And check out the Culture Journalist. And for everyone watching and listening, thank you for watching and listening, and keep reading.